Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of our semester, which ought to be something of an experiment. Um, we're starting our treatment today of A Raisin in the Sun, but I'm beginning here with the Langston Hughes poem Harlem. Why? Because it is from this poem that the play gets its title, A Raisin in the Sun, as you can see here. Um, And also, Lorraine Hansberry used this poem as an epigraph before the text of the play begins. So I can't help but read this play and think that she is making some, not just pulling a phrase for the title, but making some references here um, to the poem. And I can't help but think that, if we look at the various characters that are in the play, I wondered if Hansberry had um, something in mind with a particular character or with references to this family that we're looking at. For example, I mean, at the end when we see, or does it explode? I mean, what character of the members of this family do you associate with someone who is about to explode from having his dream deferred? I mean, Walter Lee, I think he calls himself at one point, he says, "Man, I'm a volcano." And in that scene where they have the African music and the drumming, and he is this, he explodes verbally with people. And so I think we could actually look at him as being a character in the play that Hansberry's using the poem to refer to. What are some of the other things? Who is it that might be drying up like a raisin in the sun? Um, Perhaps Ruth. She's thinking about having an abortion. I guess we could, or when I look at maybe just sags like a heavy load. I wasn't sure if that could possibly be a reference to either Ruth or to Mama. They're all under this burden in this play. And so I thought, I wanted to talk about characters in this first video. And I thought this would be a way of introducing the theme of, we could go through this poem and maybe, try to identify. If we had more time, I think we would do this as a class discussion. But it would be fun to associate different characters with different parts of the poem. I also thought some good connections could be made to another work that we read recently. Think of Death of a Salesman. Do we see another kind of American dream being pursued in Raisin in the Sun? And is it similar in that it is like a myth that is something that can damage a person or a family? I mean, this is another play about a very tight knit but um, a, a burdened family. So I think that, especially if we had more time in the classroom to talk about these things, it would be a really good discussion. But be thinking about maybe some of those connections that can be made. Okay, so I already mentioned that I want to talk about character in this video, but I guess the other thing I want to talk about is plot and conflict. I mean, if we study literature, if we study either fiction or drama, these are two literary styles that have plot. Okay, so plots are always motivated by conflict of some kind. We don't have stories that are about inertia. I mean, there has to be something that the main character is in conflict with, and that is resolved or not resolved. So we call that main character a protagonist. And when we talk about plot and conflict, we get normally teaching in sort of intro to literary studies. We talk about basically four different kinds of conflict. The protagonist in conflict with an antagonist, a villain, or a second one would be the protagonist at odds with or in conflict with society. Sometimes the protagonist is at odds with him or herself. And then the fourth type of conflict has to do with the protagonist being at odds with or in conflict with nature or higher powers or God or fate or destiny. If we were to try to look at this play and put into a single sentence what the plot is or what the play is about, I think we'd be hard pressed to do that. Why? Well, I think it's because this is a complex plot that involves not just one protagonist with one conflict, but a family in which there are a number of people, not all of which who is the protagonist might be a good question, but there are many different relationships and several different conflicts that are at the center of this play. So who do we have in terms of players here? Mama is the matriarch. She's the center of power. And I guess one would say that she must be the protagonist here. But then there's also Walter Lee, and he is in many ways at the center. So we've had a number of stories where who is really the main character. But anyway, Mama is at the center of power. She is the one who owns the house that she and her husband had, and so this family all live under her roof. So she has two children, Walter Lee, and Benitha, and so we have that triangle. So we have this kind of dynamic here. Both Benitha and Walter Lee, they have a conflict with each other. They're kind of at odds with each other, but they also have. They want to assert themselves against the authority of their mother. Okay, so they kind of resent that they're not in a better position. Particularly Walter. Walter is really defined by his resentment towards a lot of things, I guess. So Walter Lee is married to Ruth, as we can see here, and they are having quite a conflict their own selves. This is the first conflict really we see within the opening scene, where Walter is pressuring her. She is resisting him. Their marriage seems to be not in a good position, and it has to do with a lot of things. But it has to do with their poverty. It has to do with the fact that Walter Lee has a dream, that different kind of American dream, but his dream to not to be a chauffeur working for a white man is the dream that is deferred. The first one that we see. Travis is their son, and Travis in a way is kind of like a miniature Walter, and we don't really know how he'll turn out in the end, but he's going to be suffering a similar kind of problem in terms of the poverty that the family faces. So when we talk about Walter and Mama, here's the younger, maybe the son rebelling against the authority of the parent. Do you get a sense of who is right or wrong in this struggle? It's probably not one easy answer. She really cares about her children, but she doesn't really like what their values are. Walter wants to take some of the insurance money and invest in a liquor store, and we can kind of see that clearly an African American Christian woman like Mama would see that as being something that is not that preferable. Mama, excuse me, Mama and Benitha have a much more positive relationship, and Mama clearly supports Benitha's education and her desire to be a doctor. But they don't quite understand each other that much either. As Mama doesn't really understand the African roots movement that Benitha seems to be quite a big part of in that day. So with Walter and Benitha, the issues are gender related. Walter being the man who's trying to be the breadwinner for his family, thinks Benny shouldn't be pursuing being a doctor. She should do women's work. Perhaps he is jealous of her education. Money for school could be put to practical use. Ruth is an interesting character since she acts as a kind of a buffer between these opponents. She fights with Walter, but she defends him in front of Mama. She tries to get Walter to see Mama's side of things. And she is also a buffer of sorts between Mama and Benny, trying to smooth over their differences. The three of them also seem at times to form a kind of alliance, the three of them in the triangle. And usually Walter Lee is, in the midst of the conflict that is at hand there. More on the subplot level is conflict Beneatha feels in choosing between Joseph Assegai and George Murchison. They represent for her paths that she can follow, although she really can't do both. George represents what is being referred to as assimilationists. So these would be African Americans who believe that the best way they can succeed is to just fit in with the dominant white culture. The African roots movement that Joseph Assegai, well, he's clearly African, not just African American, but he is that other influence on Beneatha that is kind of pulling at her, that she is attracted to. But, in pursuing being a doctor, that's more of a normal American success story. There are a variety of characters and conflicts, and if we list them all, we can find conflicts of individuals against others, against society, in struggles with nature, with God, and in gender issues. So it gets very complex, but there is a clear feeling of balance in the story. This is a very well put together plot in terms of the conflicts being carefully integrated into the story. So I've put a link on the Course Connect page to a TV adaptation of the play that I encourage you to watch, at least, through the first act up to the point where the check comes. You can kind of really see those conflicts in the relationships when in watching. It's a pretty good performance from what I've seen. But the last thing I want to talk about here is that the arrival of that check. Right? This is a check for $10,000, and it's a very ironic situation because this check is supposed to be the thing that would bring joy and relief to a family that has suffered a lot of poverty and conflict, and instead of bringing relief and joy, it drives a wedge of resentment between its members. All right, so that's about it for what I have now. For now, we'll be back to talk about the next class day, if you want to call it that, in a couple days. Okay.